Ethan stepped to the window. Motorcycles, in the middle of nowhere. He opened the door, ready for trouble. Instead, a woman stood there and said, "Please, we need shelter." The kind of cold that makes Wood complain had settled into the cabin, a quiet ache in the walls and floorboards. Ethan Cole sat close to the fireplace, coaxing the last thin pieces of oak to catch. The flames licked up, tried to be brave, then fell back into a red mutter, like they had run out of reasons to keep going. He held his hands over the heat and rubbed at the soreness in his knuckles, the old Marine habit of cataloging pain without giving it a name. On the couch, Leia had curled herself into a careful shape, knees tucked, cheeks pink with sleep, a worn teddy bear pressed to her chest. Every so often she gave a sigh that lifted and fell like a small wave. Ethan tucked the blanket around her again and stood there a moment, listening to the storm rasp against the window. Snow whispered under the sill. Wind explored the seams of the house, found the same old weaknesses, and made them known. "Almost morning," he said softly, without checking the clock. "We'll make it to morning." The room smelled of smoke and damp wool. His coat, hung on a chair back, gave up shy little puffs of cold every time he moved past it. He thought of the workshop that used to hum behind this cabin, the way metal rang when a frame settled into place, the shy first cough of an engine he had rebuilt, the grin he could never quite stop when a bike answered his hands. That sound had been his winter then, work warming him from the inside out. He swallowed. The silence that followed bankruptcy had a weight no one warned him about. He stirred the coals with a poker and counted the remaining logs, 2 good ones and a handful of splinters. He could stretch that until sunrise if the wind behaved. If not, he'd give Leia the blanket and sit in his jacket, letting his own breath fog and fade. He brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. She stirred, blinked, then found him with a sleepy smile. "Daddy, I'm here. Is it still snowing?" "Still," he said, that small word carrying more than weather. "Go back to sleep." She did. He eased the last log onto the fire, laid the splinters like kindling around it, and waited for the timid blue edge of flame to grow bolder. Somewhere far off, the storm shifted its voice, a deeper note beneath the wind, or maybe his imagination asking for something to change. He held still, listening. The cabin answered with its familiar creaks. The world beyond the window was only white upon white, night pressing its face to the glass. He sat again, elbows on knees, and let the quiet stack up inside him until it almost felt like prayer. When the sound came a second time, low, distant, not quite thunder, he turned his head toward the window and frowned, unsure if what he'd heard belonged to the storm or to Hope learning how to speak. The wind shifted again, carrying with it a sound that didn't belong to the mountain. Ethan straightened, listening hard. It wasn't the groan of the trees or the long moan of snow slipping from the roof. This was deeper, metal grinding against wind, rhythmic, alive. He stood and walked to the window, brushing frost away with his sleeve. For a moment, there was only the blur of snowflakes rushing past the glass. Then, through the white chaos, came light. One beam at first, then another, then 20. He blinked. Headlights. Motorcycles. The sight was so absurd in that storm that he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. Who in their right mind would ride through a blizzard? But the low rumble grew into a steady thunder, the kind that vibrated through bone. His pulse quickened. Instinct, the kind the Corps had carved into him, told him to prepare. He slipped on his coat, grabbed the old flashlight from the shelf, and stepped outside. The cold slapped him full in the face, sharp enough to sting his eyes. Snow reached his ankles immediately, and his breath turned to mist before it even left his lips. He raised the flashlight toward the road, squinting into the storm. The lights drew closer, 20 bikes cutting through the whiteout like a procession of ghosts. They weren't speeding, they moved with precision, keeping formation even as wind battered them. Whoever led them knew what they were doing. When the first bike crested the hill, Ethan could make out the figure at its head, a tall woman in a heavy black jacket streaked with snow, her helmet's visor glowing under the light. She slowed, lifted a gloved hand, and the rest of the riders followed suit. Engines quieted one by one, replaced by the heavy breathing of exhausted machines and the whisper of falling snow. Ethan stood still, his boots sinking deeper into the drift. He wanted to ask what they were doing here, wanted to know if they were lost, but his voice stuck. The woman dismounted, movements deliberate and calm, and removed her helmet. A fall of dark hair escaped, and beneath it, a face marked not by fear but by steady resolve. Her eyes found him through the snow. "We need shelter, please." Her words cut through the storm more clearly than the headlights ever could. Behind her, 20 women waited in silence, faces pale, frost catching in their lashes. Something in her tone, firm but human, unlocked Ethan's hesitation. He knew what it was to lead people through chaos. He knew what it was to ask for help with dignity still intact. He glanced back at the cabin, its weak light flickering through the cracks, then at the little girl sleeping inside. Logic whispered that he had too little to offer. But the old Marine in him, the father, the man who still believed in decency, even when everything else had fallen apart, knew there was only one answer. For a long breath, neither of them moved. The woman's words hung in the air, fragile but unwavering. Snowflakes gathered in her hair, melting down her cheeks like quiet tears that refused to admit defeat. Behind her, the rest of the riders stood in patient formation, their engines ticking as they cooled, the storm pressing against their backs like a living thing trying to swallow them whole. Ethan shifted his weight, the flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. He wanted to speak, to say something reasonable, that the cabin was too small, that there wasn't enough food or heat, but the excuses died in his throat. Her eyes, dark, steady, not pleading but expecting, made him feel as though he were being tested, not as a man, but as a measure of what kind of soul he had left. "Come in," he said finally, the words sounding foreign in his own voice. Relief swept through the group, like wind catching sails. The women dismounted, boots crunching against the snow, laughter and exhaustion mingling in the night air. The leader, Sierra, though he didn't know her name yet, nodded once in gratitude and followed him toward the cabin. Ethan pushed the door open wide, letting the cold rush in, the warm air bleeding out to meet it. Inside, the small space filled quickly, wet boots by the door, leather gloves piled on the table, the sudden hum of quiet conversations as if life itself had found its way back inside. Leia stirred on the couch, blinking at the sudden brightness of headlamps and the unfamiliar sounds. Ethan knelt beside her. "It's okay, sweetheart," he whispered. "They're guests." The nearest rider smiled at the girl, removing her scarf to reveal a kind face touched by fatigue. "Hey there, little one," she said gently. "Did we wake you?" Leia shook her head, eyes wide with wonder. "Are you superheroes?" The question drew soft laughter around the room. "Close enough," Sierra replied, her tone light but worn at the edges. She unzipped her jacket, steam rising faintly from the heat of her body meeting the cold air. "We ride for charity, for shelters, for women who don't have homes tonight. But tonight," she looked at Ethan, "we ran out of road before we ran out of storm." He nodded, silently motioning toward the fireplace. "It's not much, but it's warm." Within minutes, the cabin began to change. Gloves hung from chairs to dry, helmets lined the wall like polished black sentinels, and someone produced a thermos of soup that filled the air with the faint scent of tomatoes and herbs. The fire crackled louder as one of the riders fed it bits of wood scavenged from outside. Ethan stood by the door, still uncertain if he'd done the right thing. He was a man used to control, his space, his life, his losses, but something about these women, the unity between them, felt different. The loneliness that had pressed against him for months began to loosen its grip. For the first time in a long while, the cabin sounded alive. And though he wouldn't admit it yet, the storm outside no longer felt quite so endless. The cabin breathed again. Where there had been silence, there was now the soft rhythm of voices, the clinking of mugs, and the rustle of leather as jackets steamed, drying near the fire. Ethan sat on a low stool by the hearth, watching as one of the bikers, broad-shouldered, with streaks of gray in her braid, patched a leak in the roof using a tarp from her gear. Another swept melting snow from the entryway. The air grew warmer, thicker, scented with smoke and the faint spice of coffee that someone had brewed in a dented travel flask. Leia, wrapped in a blanket too big for her, sat cross-legged near the group, her teddy bear resting in her lap like an honored guest. The women treated her like one of their own, offering her cocoa, braiding her hair, telling her gentle jokes that made her giggle until she covered her mouth with both hands. Ethan hadn't heard that sound in months. It hit him harder than he expected. Sierra sat across from him on the old armchair, her posture straight, her gloved hands wrapped around a tin cup. In the flickering firelight, she looked both fierce and calm, the kind of person forged by long roads and harder choices. She studied him for a while before speaking. "You served," she said, not as a question, but as something she already knew. Ethan looked up. "How'd you tell?" She smiled faintly. "The way you move. The way you scanned us before you opened the door." He gave a small, tired chuckle. "Old habits. Hard to kill." "Some shouldn't be," she replied quietly. "Discipline, duty, protecting people, it's rare now. You did the right thing tonight." He shrugged, uncomfortable with praise. "Didn't feel like I had a choice." "That's what makes it right," Sierra said, her voice softening. "Doing good when it's not convenient. That's where it counts." For a long moment, they just listened to the fire. One of the women began humming an old country tune, the kind sung around campfires at rest stops. Others joined in, their low voices blending into something warm and human. Leia leaned her head against one biker's shoulder and closed her eyes, her breathing slowing. Ethan looked around the cabin, the patched roof, the laughter, the boots drying near the fire, and realized he hadn't felt this sense of belonging since the days in his unit. These strangers, weary and frozen, had brought something back into his home that he'd thought was lost forever: life. Sierra caught his gaze, as if she'd read his thoughts. "You've got a good little world here," she said. "Just needed a spark." He nodded slowly. "Yeah," he murmured. "I guess it did." Outside, the storm roared on, but inside, the fire no longer burned just for warmth. It burned for something larger: connection, courage, and the simple mercy of being seen. By dawn, the storm had exhausted itself. The wind tapered into a tired sigh, and the first light of morning crept through the frost-bitten window panes like shy fingers testing a new world. The cabin was quiet again, but this silence felt different, gentler, not hollow. Ethan stood by the door, his breath forming faint clouds as he looked out at the white horizon. The snowdrifts shimmered, smooth and untouched except for the trail of tire marks leading up to his porch. Behind him, the women packed their gear with practiced precision. Jackets zipped, boots stomped free of ice, helmets gleamed in the pale gold light. Their laughter was softer now, tired but peaceful, like soldiers breaking camp after a night survived. Leia stood near the hearth, hugging her teddy bear and watching as her new friends prepared to go. Sierra was the last to move. She helped fold a tarp, then walked outside with Ethan. The air was sharp enough to sting, but the world looked reborn under its layer of white. The remains of his old workshop sat half-buried near the tree lean: rusted tools, warped boards, a sign half-fallen in the snow that once read Cole's Customs. He hadn't looked at it properly in years. Sierra followed his gaze. "That was yours?" she asked. "Used to be," he said. "Built bikes. Custom frames, engines, small place, but it paid the bills. Then the market crashed, and everything else followed. My partner bailed. Bank took what was left." She crouched, brushing the snow from the sign. The faded red paint still clung to the letters like old pride refusing to die. "You built these machines?" Ethan nodded, almost embarrassed. "Before everything fell apart." Sierra straightened, eyes bright against the cold. "Then maybe it's time to rebuild." He turned toward her, uncertain whether she meant the shop or something deeper. Her tone wasn't pity. It was conviction, a quiet challenge spoken from one survivor to another. She offered a small smile before pulling on her helmet. "Thank you for last night," she said. "You opened your door when you didn't have to. People remember things like that." Ethan hesitated, then reached out a gloved hand. "Safe ride." Sierra clasped it firmly, her grip strong, grounded. "We always are." Moments later, the air filled again with the thunder of engines. One by one, the Valkyries rolled out, their taillights glowing like embers against the snow. Leia pressed her face to the window as they disappeared into the horizon. Ethan stood outside long after the sound faded, the echo of their presence lingering like warmth in his chest. The cabin behind him was still poor, still cold, but for the first time in years, it didn't feel like the end of something. It felt like the pause before a beginning. A week passed. The snow melted into rivulets that carved small paths through the mud around the cabin. The silence had returned, but this time it didn't ache the same way. It waited, like breath held before a surprise. Ethan spent his days trying to fix the roof, clearing branches, chopping wood for the next storm. Each swing of the axe felt steadier, his thoughts less heavy. Still, every time he looked toward the mountain road, he thought of the headlights that had cut through the blizzard, of the voices that had filled his home. That's when he heard it again, the low, familiar thunder rolling through the valley. At first, he thought he'd imagined it, some echo from that night. But then came the second rumble, closer this time, unmistakable. He stepped out onto the porch, and there they were, 20 motorcycles in formation, engines growling in harmony, sunlight flashing off chrome and black steel. Behind them, 3 large trucks followed, all bearing a logo he recognized even from a distance, Valkyrie Motor Company. Sierra led the convoy, her presence as commanding as before, though her expression carried something lighter now, a spark of purpose. She cut the engine, removed her helmet, and smiled. "Miss us?" Ethan laughed under his breath, shaking his head in disbelief. "I thought you were halfway across the country by now." "Not quite," she said, handing him an envelope. We had unfinished business. Inside, neatly folded, were partnership papers, official documents stamped with her company seal. And tucked between them, a handwritten letter. "You gave us shelter when you had almost nothing. Now it's our turn to give you one." He looked up, speechless. The trucks hissed as they stopped, and people began unloading crates, toolkits, welding gear, and lumber. The air filled with the sounds of work, the clang of metal, the scrape of shovels, the thud of wood hitting earth. "What is all this?" Ethan asked, though his voice was already thick with understanding. Sierra stepped beside him, her boots sinking into the slush. "We're rebuilding your workshop," she said simply. "Valkyrie Restoration Project. Jobs for veterans, single parents, anyone who needs a fresh start. You'll run it." He stared at her. "Why me?" She looked around, gesturing toward the cabin where Leia watched from the window. "Because you didn't let the cold win. That's all the qualification I need." Ethan's throat tightened. For months he had lived like a ghost, moving through the ruins of what used to be his life. Now, standing amid the noise and motion, he felt the first real pulse of purpose returning. Sierra squeezed his shoulder once, then turned to join her crew. "Let's bring this place back to life," she called. And they did. By sunset, the shell of the old shop stood proud again, roof mended, lights glowing from within. The smell of oil and sawdust filled the air. Ethan stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, as Sierra approached with a grin. "Welcome back to work, Marine," she said. He smiled, the kind that reached his eyes for the first time in years. "Feels good to report for duty again." Years slipped by quietly, not in defeat this time, but in motion. Seasons turned, and the once-forgotten cabin at the edge of town grew into something alive again. The small patch of land now housed a humming workshop, Leia's garage, its doors painted a bold, deep red, the sign proudly restored above the entrance. The clang of metal and the steady rhythm of engines filled the air each morning, blending with laughter and music. Veterans, widows, single parents, and anyone who needed a place to start over worked side by side beneath its roof. Ethan walked the floor each day with a quiet authority, his sleeves rolled to his elbows, his hands bearing the honest stains of labor. The same man who once sat alone beside dying embers now moved with purpose, steady and patient, as if he had rebuilt not just the garage but himself. Leia, now a teenager, helped after school, sorting tools, sketching designs, asking endless questions. She carried her mother's eyes, but her father's steadiness. Sometimes, when she laughed, Ethan would catch Sierra watching from across the shop with a small smile, as if remembering that first night when everything changed. The partnership between him and Sierra had grown beyond business. She visited often, always arriving in a rush of engine noise and wind, the Valkyrie emblem on her jacket gleaming in the sun. Together they ran a new branch of her foundation, training veterans and teaching mechanical trades to those left behind by circumstance. The walls of the shop were covered in framed photos, the first group of graduates, charity rides across the country, the night the project received national recognition. And then, one crisp December evening, Ethan found himself standing beside Sierra again, this time not by a fire, but on a stage lit by soft gold lights. The Valkyrie Foundation Charity Gala was in full swing, the ballroom filled with donors, riders, and the families they had helped. Leia watched proudly from the audience, her hands clasped beneath her chin. When Ethan took the microphone, he hesitated, his reflection trembling in the silver of the podium. That night, he began, voice rough. I thought the world had forgotten me. But it hadn't. It just sent angels riding through the snow. His words drew a hush over the crowd. Sierra looked down, blinking fast, her hand resting gently over her heart. Applause rose slowly, then swelled into a standing ovation. The sound filled the room like thunder reborn, warm, human, alive. Ethan turned toward Sierra, and she nodded, her smile carrying the quiet pride of someone who had seen darkness and refused to stay there. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, soft, forgiving, endless. And for Ethan Cole, it no longer meant isolation. It meant memory. It meant that somewhere out there, 20 riders might still be cutting through the cold, carrying hope to the next forgotten door. Because sometimes, he thought, all it takes is one knock, one storm, and one word. Yes, to change everything.